All right, good afternoon. And I know we still have a few of you joining, but it is 12 o'clock. So we're going to go ahead and get the webinar started. Today, the focus is on permitting, contracts, financing for renewable natural gas projects. Hopefully you've had a chance to join our previous webinars. This is actually the third webinar in a series. We kicked the series off talking about, what are the drivers of renewable natural gas projects, and is your farm a good fit for an RNG project? Secondly, we talked about the different business structures and the risks and rewards of the different considerations that you as a farm should think about before entering into partnerships and different business structures around RNG projects. And today we're again talking about permitting, contracts, and financing. So we're getting pretty far into the series. We have one more on December 1st that I'll talk about at the end. Before we get started with the speakers, I wanted to quickly talk about what we'll cover today. We'll talk about understanding the guidelines and permitting process, what to look for in a contract and agreements, and how to do proper due diligence. And then we'll start to talk about some of the financing needs that you need for your farm. But most of that will be covered now in the fourth webinar. So to quickly just kind of recap on what we've talked about before, what are the drivers behind these projects? And we've talked about this in the past two webinars, but the state incentive programs like the low carbon fuel standard, national programs like RFS, just the overall consumer demand that we see in the sustainability space today, and then just farmers' interest in diversifying their revenue stream. So we spent a good amount of time in this first webinar and encourage you to look back, showing how the LSCF credits are really driving the value of these projects. And then also talked about kind of the RINs that contribute to that as well. So if you'd like to look back at those, I really encourage you if you're interested in kind of the market and where that is today and where it's going tomorrow. And then we spent some time in this last one talking about different considerations before you move forward with the project. So are you committed to this long-term business relationship? And some of this will be hit on today with our speakers. Have you developed a succession plan, and how does this project fit in? We talked a lot about risks and kind of rewards of this project. What expertise do you have to draw from? And I think the expertise piece, more than any of the past two webinars, is most important today as we talk through the permitting, the agreements, and the contracts you need. When is the best time to reach out for experts, and how can you seek those experts, and what questions might you have to determine if they're the most credible experts? We talked again about kind of this business structure around who owns it, who manages it, and who operates it. And then who's responsible for any environmental issues or any issues that could come out of a project down the road. So these are all considerations we spoke about in the past and will carry forward in our talk today. Really quickly before we get started, I didn't want to go any further without recognizing our amazing sponsor, EPA AgSTAR. This is a really amazing program that we've been working with for several years, and they provide resources to help advance anaerobic digestion projects kind of from start to finish. So what we're talking about today. They work closely in developing tools and resources to help farms work through a lot of the questions that we get today. Wanted to point out their resources. The biggest one, Project Development Handbook. This is what this entire webinar series is really based on. So it's, when we say comprehensive, it is many, many pages of just the latest knowledge in the industry on best practices for anaerobic digestion and biogas systems. I encourage you to visit their website and look at this handbook if you're considering kind of walking through this project. It nicely accompanies all of the things that we've been talking about through this entire series. So before I turn it over to Todd, he will be our first speaker. And we also have Jordan with us. You may remember he was on the second webinar and is back with us today to talk about agreements. So I will turn it over to Todd now so he can introduce himself and talk through a permitting process and kind of what you need to watch out for.
Thank you very much, Jamie. I appreciate the background. That was very useful. In terms of my background, I am an environmental attorney with Michael Best, located here in the Midwest. Behind me today is Milwaukee, where I maintain an office. But I've worked on projects throughout the Midwest. I've been an environmental lawyer for 30 years now. I've worked on all manner of projects and certainly have worked on a fair number of anaerobic digestion systems over the years. And it's good to see that these projects are starting to get well-deserved attention by by a variety of different industry sectors, including yours. I think they offer a lot of benefits, both for the host facility, but also for others along the supply chain of for the RNG product. I am going to talk to you today with some general and then some more specific observations concerning the permitting process for these anaerobic digestion systems. I'm going to start with just some general considerations that you should be aware of, and then we'll get into some more specifics. Let me just start by saying the most general observation or consideration I would share with you is just being aware that these systems in all likelihood require a fair number of permits. The fact that you may be on this seminar here today or otherwise looking at it on YouTube puts you well ahead of the game. I would say 50% of those projects out there, I'm not sure they know going into them that in fact there are a number of permits that are required for construction and operation of these types of facilities. So kudos to you for taking time to learn more about what those permit requirements are. I would also offer the observation that we'll get into some detail here, and it may seem overwhelming. It's very manageable as long as you follow some of the tips that I'll run through here today. Again, just recognizing that these permits are necessary is a good start. And as long as you get involved early and you keep on top of it, it's definitely a manageable process. Getting into more of the specifics, one thing that I would advise all of you is not to underestimate how much time it takes to get these permits. I was looking at a report that was put together in 2017 by the Green Plains Institute. They evaluated anaerobic digester projects throughout the Midwest. And I was frankly surprised and concerned that one state in the Midwest had taken up to 4 years to issue permits for anaerobic digestion projects. I can tell you that is not my experience by any measure. In my experience, I would budget 6 to 9 months in total between filing the permit applications, plural, and getting those final permits issued. But the key is you want to make sure that you start the process early, and again, that you're diligent in that process, and you shouldn't have any problems. The other thing I would recommend is that you do an honest assessment in terms of whether you have any type of opposition to your facility within the community. And I suspect that you already know that. It's not unusual if you do, but you got to deal with that reality. And if it is practical to do so, I think you should try to reach out and engage with that opposition before you do a project like this. These projects have a lot of positive attributes to them in a variety of different ways. And I think you have a lot of good things to say to the community, including your opposition about these projects. And I would encourage you to reach out and engage with them to the extent it's practical. It isn't always, but if it is practical in your case, you should do it. The other thing is to reach out to regulators, those that are going to issue these permits. It's a very wise thing to do to have a pre-permit application meeting with those regulators, just to make sure you understand what their expectations of you might be, but equally so that you can share your expectations with the permitting entity to make sure they know what your timing looks like, what your needs are, and so forth. It just makes for a much easier process as you proceed if you had that pre-application meeting. The other thing I would mention as a general consideration is to involve professionals. I don't know about you, but personally, I use accountants at this point to do my taxes. I've given up trying to keep up on the tax laws and the like. They change all the time. These rules and regulations that apply to permitting of these types of facilities, they're constantly changing, either through the states or the feds, or even sometimes through the courts. So I would recommend that you just get a professional involved to take care of the permitting for you. in almost all circumstances, that's going to be an engineering firm or a technical firm. They do the heavy lifting. I do think, and it's admittedly, I guess it's somewhat self-serving, but I do think that lawyers can bring value to these types of projects, and you should involve them definitely in the contracting work that Jordan will talk about in a moment. But you should also involve them in just overseeing some of the permitting that you need to do. They can provide you with some good thoughts on occasion, and depending on your project, and can also issue spot for you and make sure that you build a robust record in the event that you have any type of challenge to the permit authorizations that you receive. Next slide.
All right, this is great. A quick question that came through. Should the farm meet with and engage with potential opposition and regulators ahead of finding kind of those professionals that they'll need to move forward the process? At what point should that be done? And that should that be done just by the farm, or once they've kind of sought out the professionals to help them through the process?
That's a great question. And, it will vary based upon the particular circumstance, but I would say as a general matter, I would tend to put your team together, get that engineering firm on board before you reach out and talk to the opposition. And the reason for that is the engineering firm will help you develop talking points, quantifying and identifying all of the benefits that your project may have in terms of reduced emissions. If you have odor issues, these projects often help that. A lot of, depending on what you do with the gas, there's a lot of climate change attributes associated with it that engineering firm, I think, will help you quantify. The other thing that I think they can do, both the engineering firm and lawyers, is stick to your message, identify what your message is, identify, frankly, warts that you may have with your project. They tend to come to these projects with a little less investment, if you will, or bias towards the project, and they help you assess, what your strong points are, what maybe some of your weaker points are, and they can help you advance your public message with that type of viewpoint.
Great. We'll keep moving, and as more questions come in, we'll either get to those during or after the presentation.
Sounds good. So let's get into the nuts and bolts here. So let's start with local permits. And by local, I mean not only the county, but also the local municipality. And that could be a city, village, or town, depending on the jurisdiction. But each of those entities could very well have its own set of requirements for a project such as this. I think it'd be very rare to have one of those local entities having specific ordinances, regulations related to anaerobic digester projects per se. However, they often will have ordinances and such that apply either to ag operations, which oftentimes these digesters are integrated into, or just have very generic requirements that apply to businesses or buildings that are constructed within their jurisdiction. So it's not unusual to see obligations for obtaining a business license or registration for, say, a special purpose entity that may be created to build and operate a digester that you're involved in. You want to make sure that you're meeting those requirements. But for sure, you're likely to see building permit obligations and the inspection requirements that you'll have to meet. You want to identify those early on. You're going to have zoning issues that you have to deal with. Make sure that where you're locating this project is properly zoned. You may have to change that. You may need other zoning approvals. And then it's not unusual that you may have to get a conditional use permit or amend a conditional use permit that's already been issued for the property where this would be located. It's said that all politics are local, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. If you are in a farming operation, I think you would probably agree with that statement. My guess is if you're in a farming operation, you already have a pretty good handle on local politics. And like I mentioned before, you probably want to engage with some of those officials before going in and seeking permits or announcing the project publicly. Next slide.
Yeah, that's great advice. And we got kind of a comment along those same lines around when to kind of engage the local politics and also just the community and communicating the benefit of this project and what it can provide to the local community, whether that's economically or through, energy. So would you advise that a lot of this happen with both, from the political side, but also just engaging the community and demonstrating the benefits through community events kind of prior to working through the permit process?
Yeah, I think that's very good advice. Again, these projects tend to be, in their needs, tend to be specific to the circumstance and situation that's involved. But as a general matter, I would definitely agree with that. As I mentioned before, engage with your opposition. Along the same lines, I think engaging with your local community, not that they're opposed to what you're doing, but they're in your backyard, they're your neighbors, you interact with them in a variety of different contexts. It's just a good business practice for anaerobic digesters or any other thing you may be doing at your operation to try to reach out and engage with the community in which you operate to make sure they're comfortable with what you're doing, and equally important so that you can hear from them any concerns, suggestions, good or bad, that they may have with respect to what you're doing, because it's through that communication that I think you can best address any concerns that the community may have, and before it blows up and that dispute ends up in a different venue where it becomes a little bit more difficult to manage. So good advice, a good comment, and I would agree with it.
Great.
Moving on, state and federal permits. These tend to be the ones that require more attention, more resources, both in terms of money and time. And the controversies tend to lie with these types of permits. First, just to do the construction work on one of these projects, you're going to need a construction stormwater runoff permit. As the name implies, it's a permit with obligations that you have to fulfill to make sure that sediment and other things from your construction site don't find their way into navigable waterways. So if you look at the picture that you see here on this slide, you see dirt that's been mounded here through the center of the picture. And to the right, you see white silt fencing. I don't know in this circumstance, but my guess is that's silt fencing that was installed pursuant to a construction stormwater permit to make sure that dirt doesn't end up finding its way into a navigable waterway. Another permit that often is required here, but not always, but in my experience, probably 80 to 90% of the jurisdictions require air permits for these digester projects. And if they do require air permits, there's generally two that are required. One would be a construction air permit. And as the name implies, that's a permit you have to obtain before you commence construction. I can't tell you how many enforcement cases I've defended where companies have commenced construction without getting an air permit. They find out afterwards that they need one, they get it, and they end up getting an NOV and sued by the local jurisdiction over not having a construction permit beforehand. Once construction has been completed, you then need to get an operation permit to obviously operate the equipment thereafter. It's not unusual for the agency to issue both of them at one time, but they are technically two separate permits. Another permit that you'll need to operate the facility would be a stormwater discharge permit, much like the construction stormwater permit, the operation stormwater permit. Just make sure that you have protections in place so that when rainwater precipitation falls on your property and runs off, that it's not carrying pollutants into navigable waterways. Lastly, it's not unusual at all, especially if a digester is co-located at a CAFO, that CAFO will already have an NPDES permit, allowing it to discharge water into a navigable waterway, but also allow for spreading of manure on local fields and the like. You want to make sure that this digester system that you're installing is incorporated into not only the permit document, but all the ancillary documents associated with that, including your nutrient management plan and the like. Last slide. So here, I think, is really the value that I can add to all of you, and it's things to watch. Like I mentioned, I've handled a number of these in various jurisdictions, and there's some things that I would say, tend to pop up publicly or not publicly, but you definitely want to think about them. First thing is, who's going to be the permittee? And in these projects, you can have all kinds of different entities or individuals involved: the developer, the owner, the operator, and so forth. Who's going to hold the permits? As a general matter, you don't want to be the permit holder. The permit holder is the one that's responsible for doing everything required by the permit. And if it's not done, you're the entity that ends up getting sued, and fines get imposed on them for not following the permit. As a legal matter, you don't have much choice. In my experience, the permit issuer tends to want the permittee to be the individual that's operating the digester system on a day in, day out basis, and has the ability and the authority to shut down that digester in the event that for whatever reason it's not meeting its obligations under a permit. So that's something that you want to talk about early on. You're going to have to designate it in the application, but you want to talk to your partners on this project about who's going to be the permittee. Next would be permit for all contingencies. Depending on where this gas is going to go, if it goes into a pipeline, for instance, under normal operation, you're not going to have very many air emissions or water emissions associated with it. But if you burn that gas on site, you will have a lot of emissions associated with burning that gas. But you need to nonetheless permit for all the contingencies that may occur. And by that, I mean, these systems sometimes will break down. Sometimes they need to undergo maintenance, which means you got to take that gas that you normally process and say put into a pipeline, and you got to flare it. You have to permit for that. So make sure your permit acknowledges all these potential contingencies, no matter how remote they may be, to make sure you have authorization to do those things once this thing starts operating. Another point, the third bullet here that I warn you about, is there's going to be, unfortunately, some uncertainty about the air permitting obligations of CAFOs, dairies, and the like, that I think we're going to start seeing pop up in the very near future. Back under the George W. Bush administration, a lot of these uncertainties were stayed, I guess is the word that I would use. There was a plan put in place where CAFOs, dairies, and the like would enter into consent decrees, pay a nominal fee, and that fee was to be used by EPA to create a permitting program for CAFOs. That really didn't happen. A lot of farms entered into those consent decrees, paid the money, but the EPA really has not created a robust program for CAFOs and dairies and the like. What that has been kind of floating around out there for quite some time. A couple of weeks ago, October 26th in particular, a petition was filed with the Biden EPA asking them to do two things. One is to rescind all those consent decrees, and secondly, to start enforcing the Clean Air Act against these CAFOs, which really means to start permitting them. The reason I mention that is because of the fourth bullet. Oftentimes, regulators will view these digesters as being part of the facility on which they're located. So if a digester is going on a CAFO and that CAFO doesn't have an air permit, you could find yourself caught up in this looming, I think, set of issues as to whether that dairy needs its own permit, and because you're part of that dairy, whether the whole shooting match needs a permit. So something to keep an eye on that you want to talk about and try to manage going early on in the project. The next bullet is you want to avoid regulators trying to do what I just described, and that's aggregating your digester project with other facilities that may be linked physically or simply by sharing a common border with your project. Best explained by an example, I had a project where it was a rendering plant that was sending organic matter to a digester. It was located 3 miles away, located on a CAFO, and it was connected by an 18-inch pipe. So 3 miles apart, connected by a pipe. The regulators held that's That's one facility. They put an umbrella over it figuratively and said that's one facility for permitting. It was a problem because the rendering plant was operated by company A, the digester by company B, but they wanted it permitted as one facility. So that's something you got to keep an eye out for. Last thing would be air dispersion modeling. What is that? So when you get a permit, one of the things regulators will do is they'll want to make sure that the air emissions from your facility are not causing excess air pollution on your neighbor's property. And the way they typically do that is through a computer model, which I refer to as an air dispersion model. It'll predict what the pollution concentrations will be from your facility on the neighboring property. I can tell you that the big issue with digesters, at least if it's a manure digester, will be SO2 emissions, sulfur dioxide. To put this in perspective, a very large, say 5,000 head dairy could very well have many more emissions than a very large industrial complex. I do a fair amount of work for all kinds of industry sectors, including dairies, and the SO2 profile from a large dairy could be maybe 3 times higher than, say, a petroleum refinery, just to put that in perspective. It's not unusual for these dairies to have difficulty passing an air dispersion model. So you want to make sure that if you have to do modeling, that you get a handle on that early on. So with that, let me end and hand it over to Jamie and Jordan to talk about contracts and the like.
All right, great, Todd. And those were a really nice list of kind of watch out fors. And I know a couple of questions came from your presentation, so we'll be sure to address those at the end after Jordan presents on contracts and building strong relationships around some of the agreements. So I will turn it over to Jordan, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamie. Hello again to everybody who was listening back in October when I kind of introduced this topic. And welcome to others who haven't yet met me. I am a law partner of Todd Palmer's here at Michael Best and Friedrich. I've got a background both in agriculture regulation, particularly with CAFOs and water issues, and also a very deep background in energy. So when it comes to this renewable natural gas space in the context of CAFOs especially, I feel like I've got 2 pretty deep areas of knowledge, which I was lucky enough to match up and be able to provide good service and advice to farmers and developers alike who are engaging in these transactions to build renewable natural gas facilities on farm sites. Next slide, please. So last time we talked about potential farm roles, and for the folks who excuse me, weren't at last month's webinar, I'm just going to cover those potential roles or business models quickly. So the farm can be an owner, or it can be a partner or a supplier. So in the farm owner model, the farm basically develops the project itself. It comes up with all the capital, it owns everything. It enters into all the contracts that are necessary to construct, operate, maintain the project, and it basically takes control of the gas all the way through a series of contracts, all the way out to California or wherever the gas is going to be used and burned and monetized into credits. Now, while there is a very lucrative potential there, in my experience, only a very few farms are interested in doing this, and in doing dozens of these transactions, I only know of one who successfully went all the way through the process to develop and own its own renewable natural gas project. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Of course, if anybody wants to know how to do that and wants, you know, to bounce it off me, I can talk to you more about it. But generally, the agreements that you're going to need to think about are you're going to have a development agreement with some experts who are going to basically take charge of developing unless you want to learn from the ground up. Those developers are going to want a fee. They may even ask for a carry interest in the project of a few percent so that they get an annuity payout. You're going to have to negotiate the engineering, procurement, and construction agreements, or a construction management agreement with a firm who's going to watch over everybody like a hawk. You're going to need, I mean, you're essentially going into a new business here if you do it this way. So you're going to need people to operate and maintain the RNG project, the digester, and the biogas upgrade plant, and so on. You're going to need, and now let's talk about what you're going to need downstream of the biogas upgrade plant. So now you made your gas, great, but you need to get it in a truck and inject it into the pipeline. If you're not lucky enough to have a pipeline, interstate pipeline right on your property, you might not need to truck it, but 9 times out of 10, you're going to need to, or probably even more. So you need to either own trucks and transport the gas, or you're going to need to contract with somebody to do it. You're going to have to work with the pipeline to inject the gas, and you're going to have to work with people who are expert at making sure once it's in the pipeline, it gets to where it needs to go, is offloaded and distributed as transportation fuel, and that everything else is done that needs to be done in order to turn that gas into very lucrative credits. So again, to close this off, I've just not seen a lot of farms even interested in playing that huge role and getting into this new business themselves. It's certainly possible, but most want to either perform either as a partner in a project or just a straight up supplier. Now, what's the difference between those two things? In a partnership, the farm is still the supplier. It supplies either the manure or the biogas if there's already a digester, right? But it's still, but then it owns part of the project company, meaning you're getting some of the economic profit benefits back. Well, what does a developer want in exchange for you being a partner? They're going to want a pretty significant cash infusion, or they're going to want a trade of some kind of other value. Those are a little more common. I've had 2 or 3 farm clients who've opted to explore and negotiate a partner relationship with a developer. It was, the value given was either a cash infusion or a trade of some land and so on. The percentages can vary, and the possibilities are pretty endless with respect to how much of the project company can the farm own and so on. So for that relationship, you're going to need a shareholder or member agreement if you're going to be a partner, just like you were a partner in any other kind of business. And you're probably going to need a development agreement where you split up the responsibilities for getting this project built. I saw one of the questions were, who ought to pay for getting the permits in a partner business model? Well, the imagination is the limit. You can allocate those requirements, however you want to, as long as they make economic sense to both parties. The things that you'll always have under the partner or supplier model is you're going to have a supply agreement of some kind. Again, manure if you don't have a digester yet, and biogas if you have a digester, meaning the raw gas out of the digester. You're going to have to supply that to the developer, who will then make the renewable natural gas. You're also going to need to have, again, whether it's a partner or a supplier relationship, you're going to need to lease some land to the project company so they can put their equipment on there for the digester and for the biogas upgrade plant, for bringing trucks in and turning around and taking the gas off site. And those lease agreements also come often with easements, which means, you're leasing them a 2 or 3 acre parcel right close to the dairy production site or farm production site. But they're also going to need access easements for roads coming in. If it's not immediately adjacent to the leased property, they're going to need utility easements for running lines and gas and so on. So those kind of go hand in hand. When I negotiate these transactions, I put the lease and easements all in one agreement to make it simple. And then we don't record that whole thing. We just record what's called a memorandum of it, which generally describes what the arrangement is. Next slide, please. So this brings me to what are the things that you got to watch out for when you negotiate these contracts. And I'm not suggesting you negotiate them yourselves. Of course, as a lawyer, I'm going to recommend that you get a lawyer. But here, if I lose sleep at night about any of these things, it's about the farmers going off and trying to do these things on their own and not knowing all of the issues that need to be covered. And you know what? A lot of times people think, the thing is with these agreements, so much attention is paid to things that are never going to happen or may never happen. But that's just the problem, is that those things that may never happen and rarely happen they're low probability, but they're very high consequence. So that's why these things have to be covered, particularly when you're talking about a 30-year arrangement typically. So this is going to affect the next generation. I wanted to talk about this by model. So ownership model, I'll keep it short again for the reason that there just aren't many of these out there. But if you're going to try to develop one of these things on your own, you've got to find the experts. Doing that is a little bit tough because most of the people who have expertise in this space are into making money off these projects as owners, not in advising others how to be owners. So I'm not saying they're not out there, but they're difficult to find. And once you find them, the question is do they have a team that can get this done for you? And in that sense, also, you're going to have a hard time keeping fees under control, because if they're not going to be owners, they're going to want to extract as much economic value as they can. That's just, rational human stuff. And they're going to usually ask for a very big upfront fee, which many farmers don't want to have to finance before, the revenue's coming in. Number two, they'll often, as I mentioned before, they want to carry interest. They want to actually get, repeating allocations of profits. So let me move now to the supply agreements and lease and easement agreements that you're going to have in any case if you're not the owner. So the thing that I've bolded and for the feedstock and supply agreement is deadlines. Okay, you got to have a deadline for the developer to finish getting this project built. Because if you sign a 30-year agreement and there's no deadline and they have the right to all your manure or your biogas, and you don't have a deadline in there, then what are you going to do 10 years down the road when they're still making excuses about not being able to build the project for one reason or another, and you're locked up? You can't go with anybody else. So even though it seems obvious, unfortunately, I've met a lot of farms that, have already negotiated their agreements and they don't contain these deadlines. Every day that you are locked in with somebody who's not producing when you could be with somebody else is a huge opportunity cost. Here's some of the other things you need to worry about with the feedstock supply. If you're going to be supplying manure, they're going to want a certain specification for the manure. And they're going to want it free of debris. They're going to want it free of many of them don't want any feed leachate in there. Many of them would rather that you're bedding on solids than sand. And that all has to do with the carbon intensity score that they'll be able to achieve. So they may want upgrades. Well, you're going to have to negotiate who pays for those. Most of the times, the farm has the developer pay for those. And they end up being some very beneficial upgrades for the farmer. But you need to really talk about exactly what those upgrades are going to be, who's paying for them, and when those have to be finished. I always negotiate design approval for my farmers, because that especially manure handling in the digester take up a lot of room. And you're going to want to make sure that the cows aren't subjected to a whole lot of noise. You want to make sure that the physical arrangement is in a way that works for you on the production side. We all want to be super efficient. We don't want to have bottlenecks in the production effort because of a design problem. The next thing you got to worry about is, a lot of farms who are producing biogas in particular, and some who just produce manure, they have agreements with other companies that are getting some kind of credit for something from the manure or the biogas, right? You can't go into another arrangement without first taking care of that first one, because they already own all the attributes and everything else. Most of the time, the developer can come to a good arrangement with your counterparty that's already got rights to the manure and so on, but let them worry about that. That's something that they're very good at. If they want your manure or they want your biogas, they will find a solution. Third-party manure is also a big issue, right? They're going to build a biogas plant that has a capacity on how much it can produce. You don't want them bringing third-party manure in to produce gas when you have the manure available. If there's a reason for bringing third-party manure in because they built it bigger than they need for your manure, well, then you ought to have a tipping fee, or you ought to have clear understandings that they are responsible for everything that could go wrong with that third-party manure. And if you have a storage limitation, they better be taking the effluent that's attributable to that manure offsite. So you want to worry about that. You want to worry about what are the remedies for the developer if for some reason you can't provide manure. You need to have active God exceptions so that if the pipes freeze and you can't deliver the manure, you're not going to get you're not going to get dinged for that. Is one example. Compensation, the type and amount of compensation is at the core of these deals. And I always tell my farmers, I cannot tell you if the price that's being offered is good, because I don't know what costs are going in. I don't know what's behind that black curtain on the cost for the developer. I don't know what the costs of your operation are, and so on. But there are people who I work with who can help figure out whether the price being offered is good for your circumstances, particularly given what your carbon intensity score is going to be. Assignment, I've bolded that as well. And I'm going to spend a lot more time on this feedstock and supply than the lease and easement, because this is really important. The assignment of the agreement is something you need to be able to do as farmers, that the developer needs to be able to do for its reasons. So you can't agree to, or you want to be very careful about agreeing to a provision in a feedstock supply agreement that says, farmer, you can't assign this agreement, because you're going to maybe transfer the farm either to the next generation or to somebody completely different. But you need the ability to do that. And that takes some negotiation, because most developers don't want that to happen without their permission. You also want to worry about what's coming out of the digester and what's coming out of that biogas upgrade plant. Most of you who are familiar with digesters know that you're going to have a very big volume of effluent coming out of the digester. It's going to be constituted a little bit. It's going to be less nutrient intensive, less odorous than the manure going in, fewer total solids and so on, because you're going to be reusing those for bedding. But you got to make sure that it's clear that what's coming out of that digester and what's coming, the condensate coming out of the biogas upgrade plant, don't contain hazardous materials or materials that are going to deteriorate your equipment, and most importantly, your waste storage facilities. Those are the main things for the feedstock supply agreement that I thought would be useful to talk about here today. With the few minutes I have left, I'll talk about the lease and the easement. They go hand in hand. If you want to go back to the slide, Jamie, quick. Just to tie this up quickly, on the lease and easement, be as specific as possible about what area of the production area they're going to have to do their thing. Very tight land description. I really like Google Earth overheads together with a written description. You're going to want to allocate responsibility for taxes very carefully, and you're going to want to be very careful about making sure that you're complying with your mortgage covenants with your senior farm lender, and that you know what you're doing when you subordinate your mortgages to the leasehold interest of the project company. Assignment is important here, together with co-termination of the supply agreement. You want those assignment and termination provisions to work hand in hand with both agreements. Okay, next slide, Jamie. Finally, I know we were looking for someone else to maybe talk about the financing issue here today with much more depth than I could possibly do today. But Jamie had asked me if I had a couple of points that I might be willing to share on what I've seen in doing these transactions on financing. I have not handled either the equity financing or the bank financing piece, but a lot of what we do is impacted with these other agreements is impacted by the financing. So just a few things, you know, you can have equity financing, meaning cash is coming from a private source to finance this project. You can have debt financing, meaning it's coming from a bank, or you can have a combination of the two that stack up to yield the money that's necessary to build these projects. So the equity financing considerations, I'll tell you that it's been my experience that the developers that have been quickest to market, meaning quickest, you know, to have steel in the ground and to get these projects up and running, are the ones that finance these projects with equity. And the reason I say that is because I think it's fair to say that, you know, private equity sources are going to be a little more willing to take risk than banks are. They're going to demand higher returns for sure, but they're more willing to take risk. The debt financing sources, of course, that's economically different. You're not paying as much of a return to a bank as you would to an equity investor. But in my experience, that's a much longer lead process. And you still, most lending institutions who would be the natural go-tos for this, including senior farm lenders, are still in the process of getting comfortable with what these projects are and what the risks are of the investment made in these projects. I've not seen a bank yet that would be satisfied to collateralize the debt for one of these projects with the accounts receivable under the supply agreement. Rather, they're still looking to collateralize with farm assets or with land. And I think until, especially where balance sheets are tight, I think, you know, until banks get more comfortable, we're going to see most of these deals financed with equity. So much more detail will be discussed at a future webinar on this financing subject. But Jamie, thanks for allowing me to present today. And I see there's a few questions here I might be able to answer if you'd like me to take a shot at it.
Sure. Yeah, I think some were answered in the chat. If I can start with one of them, what new EPA requirements do you anticipate under the climate action plans related to methane emission reductions under COP26 goals in the future?
I'll let Todd take that one.
Well, that's a good question. In terms of specifics, you know, it's hard to say what's going to come out of COP26, at least for me. I think more generally, certainly methane is getting a lot of attention as a greenhouse gas pollutant. And we've been seeing that over the course of the last 6 months or so, primarily focused on the oil and gas sector. However, I do think that trend of focusing on methane is going to extend into different areas, and agriculture certainly would be one of them. I mean, that's part of why these RNG projects are so attractive and are providing the revenue that Jamie had summarized in the beginning of this presentation. But you know, I think as a notional matter, as a general matter, we're certainly going to see more attention on methane, and that means more regulation of it going forward.
All right, awesome. And if I can have you both maybe, or one of you expand on this within the chat, and really the theme of today's webinar was seek out expert, right? And expertise to help you work through some of these permitting and agreement processes. Do you have any advice on just questions farmers should ask when they're seeking out experts to really determine if they might be a good fit and they're credible and they're going to kind of follow through with the project in a successful way?
Well, I'll take an initial stab at this. It depends what you mean by experts. I mean, if you're pursuing the ownership model, you know, I think you've got a real tough row to hoe. I would start with an engineering firm, probably, that is very experienced or more experienced than others with these kinds of deals, and work from there, I think. Because they're going to be, or with a law firm that knows its stuff with these transactions, and then just do interviews. And where you go from there is, you know, you have to rely on others that know the space. If you're talking about evaluating the credibility and the bona fides of developers, I think you just got to very straight up ask them, how many of these projects have you done? You know, where are they? Can I talk to the farmers? And some of them are going to tell you, well, we haven't done any yet. And there's a lot of those around because this is new, and there's a lot of people trying to get into the space. And that's how these things work. There are several who do have many projects in the ground, and they ought to be very willing, if they're worth their salt, sharing the information with you and, you know, connecting you with someone else.
That's great. We did also have one about permit fees. And if those are negotiated within the development agreement, kind of who pays the fees? I think Todd kind of punted this one to you, Jordan. And what is the market in terms of what is it typical for such agreements?
Yeah, as I mentioned when I answered this a couple minutes ago, I think the sky's the limit. I mean, it's limited by imagination. So you can allocate it however you want. Typically, the developer is going to pay for, in the supply role, where the farm is not a partner, the developer is going to pay for getting all the permits that are necessary to make the operation work. In the partnership model, where the farm is an economic partner in the project company, those can be allocated however the parties decide it makes sense to do it.
Great. Another question we had come through, and we didn't really get into this too much around financing, but how important is it to explore kind of the who will be receiving carbon credits and tax credits, and how does a farm start to approach those conversations? I know we've talked about in the past, ensure that when you're entering these deals that you're not necessarily giving away all of your environmental credits, and that could be even beyond carbon credits in the future. So thinking through what the terms of that agreement might be. Do you have any maybe high level kind of thoughts on that we can leave the group with?
Yes. First of all, the tax credits are going to go to the project company. That's who's going to own them. They're going to buy the attributes from the farm. They're going to basically have a big section in the agreement that says, we own all the environmental attributes, and we're going to define environmental attributes to be all credits or benefits or anything else coming out of manure or the biogas. And you know what? That makes sense, and that's fine. But what I try to preserve for farmers is their right to earn any other kind of benefits downstream of the digester. Meaning when that effluent comes back to the farm, if the farm is going to be extracting nutrients, or if the farmer is going to be eligible to earn money or credits or something for how it ultimately disposes of its manure, or land spreads it with respect to techniques and so on, those are reserved for the farmer in these agreements. So that's the short answer to that question.
Great. I think we covered majority of the questions. I don't know if either of you saw any more come through that we may have missed.
Yeah, I see one that I think is important. which is how does a farm determine if the developer already has financing funding in place? You ask them, number one, but then you ask them to put their money where their mouth is. And the way I do that in agreements, if a developer will agree to it, is a deadline for a funding commitment from the financing source. Okay, so that's fine. I'm always going to have a deadline for constructing the project, usually 2 years out, maximum 3 years out from the day we sign, that it'll be up and running. But also, if you can, you want to have a deadline for the financing commitment, because that should come long before the project is up and running, even up to a year before, right? If it takes a year to build it. So if they don't have that financing commitment by a date certain, they're certainly not going to meet the deadline to construct. And I want the farm to be able to part ways from the developer as soon as they can if it's not going to work out. And so what I will, and I haven't found a lot of developers willing to agree to this, but I have been able to get some to agree to a deadline for a commitment to finance the project.
Awesome. That's great advice to leave everyone with. And I think we'll go ahead and close it up. Appreciate all the questions that came through and everyone joining today. And a big thank you to the speakers, Jordan and Todd, for sharing all the insights you have and experience that you've gained over the past few years working in the space and even beyond. So wanted to quickly walk through any upcoming events and kind of resources that we have for you. So we are now, like I said, this is the third webinar. We have links to the first two that are available. This link to the third webinar will be sent out later this week. And then I encourage you to register for our last webinar in the series. Again, we'll carry forward this conversation on financing, which is a really important one to have. And we didn't have enough time to get to today. We want to make sure that's covered. And then moving into the next webinar, it's about what happens when you start to build, right? The exciting part, we're breaking ground. We'll talk to an owner engineer who will kind of talk through how they may work on behalf of the farm to make sure the project goes smoothly and kind of what needs to be covered, as well as a couple other speakers. So I think it'll be a really great session. And you've broken ground, the project is moving forward. How is that managed from then on out? Again, I wanted to say thanks to our sponsor, EPA AgSTAR. I encourage you to visit their website and check out the Project Development Handbook. It's a really helpful resource and tool, which again, our entire series is based upon. And then if you'd like to reach out to any of us at Newtrient, again, we're a company that represents dairy farmers and helping you find solutions. From this RNG perspective, we're happy to take your call if you'd like to send me an email or reach out. Something we do offer for farms, complimentary, is just give us a call, talk to us about if you've been approached by a vendor, if you want some initial kind of first steps and what you should do. If you've received maybe a contractor from a developer and you'd like us to do some due diligence on that, we can do that as well. Again, we're kind of just helping you get started though, and can definitely recommend you to experts like Jordan and Todd and others after some initial conversations. So please feel free to reach out to any of us. You can tell that Jordan and Todd have deep expertise in this area that can help walk you through a lot of this process as well. So thank you all for joining, and we hope to see you on December 1st.